The Chinese trap begins, 2007-2010. Imagine you're standing in Colombo in January 2007, and you meet four people whose lives are about to be destroyed by Chinese debt and government incompetence. Dinesh Pereira is 35 years old, an economist at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka earning 85,000 rupees monthly, about $750, living in a comfortable middle-class Colombo apartment with his wife and young son, warning his colleagues that the massive Chinese loans President Mahinda Rajapaksa is negotiating make no economic sense. The interest rates at 6.3% are triple what World Bank charges, and the projects themselves, a port in Hambantota that no shipping lines want, an airport in the middle of nowhere, highways to empty areas, will never generate revenue to service the debt. But Rajapaksa, who just brutally ended the 26-year civil war against Tamil Tigers in 2009, killing 40,000-plus civilians, in the final offensive is riding high on nationalist fervor and sees Chinese money as a way to build monuments to himself while telling Western donors to stop lecturing about human rights. Shaminda Silva is 45, a fisherman in Hambantota on the southern coast earning 30,000 rupees monthly, 265 dav from his small boat, living near the beach where his family has fished for 3 generations, hearing rumors the government plans to build a massive port in Hambantota even though the Babao's existing small port barely has traffic and the deepwater location makes fishing dangerous, worried a large port will destroy the fishing grounds but powerless to stop a project backed by the president who wants to transform his hometown. Priya Fernando is 28, running a small textile shop in Colombo's tourist district earning 60,000 rupees monthly, $530, selling traditional handicrafts. To growing numbers of tourists now that the Civil War ended, optimistic about the future as tourist arrivals jump from 500,000 in 2009 toward 1 million in 2012, not paying attention to Chinese loans, because infrastructure sounds positive. And Kumara Bandara is 50, supervising a tea plantation near Kandy, earning 45,000 rupees monthly, 400, managing 20 workers picking tea leaves, Sri Lankan, Ceylon tea generating 1.5 billion in annual exports, his plantation producing high-quality tea using chemical fertilizers that boost yields 40% compared to organic farming, not thinking about national politics because tea prices are stable. The Hambantota Port project begins in 2007 with President Rajapaksa announcing China Harbor Engineering Company will build a deep water port at $361 million cost with 85% funding, $307 million from China Exim Bank at 6.3% interest for 15 years, significantly higher than the 0.25 to 2% that World Bank or Asian Development Bank typically charges for infrastructure projects. And unlike Western development banks requiring extensive environmental impact assessments, competitive international bidding processes, transparency about actual costs, and oversight to prevent corruption, China Exim gives the loan directly to the Sri Lankan government with only one condition: a Chinese state-owned company must build it, and Chinese workers must be employed, the contract awarded without any competitive bidding process to China Harbor Engineering, at prices that independent infrastructure analysts later determine are inflated 20-40% above actual market rates, with suspicions of kickbacks to Rajapaksa family members, though nothing is ever proven in court. Dinesh reviews feasibility studies showing Hambantota makes no commercial sense. Colombo Port, 150 miles west, already handles all container traffic efficiently and sits on main shipping routes, while Hambantota is off main routes with no industrial base to generate cargo and faces monsoon swells, making docking difficult. But when Dinesh raises concerns in government meetings, he's told Rajapaksa wants it for strategic reasons and that economic analysis matters less than geopolitics. Shaminda watches in 2008-2010 as Chinese crews blast the coastline and build massive concrete structures. Where he fished, thousands of Chinese workers imported living in segregated compounds, local fishermen forced away from construction zones, promises of jobs seeming hollow when construction. Employment goes to Chinese labor, and when Phase 1 opens in 2010 with Rajapaksa and Chinese diplomats celebrating, the port sits mostly empty with only a handful of ships monthly because shipping companies have no reason to divert from Colombo. Monuments to corruption, 2010-2017. President Rajapaksa, emboldened by military victory and facing no political opposition after crushing press, freedom, jailing journalists critical of his government, and using nationalist rhetoric to silence dissent, continues borrowing from China for increasingly absurd vanity projects that serve no economic purpose. Matala Rajapaksa International Airport opens in 2013, just 25 miles from Hambantota Port, built with $190 million in Chinese loans at 6% interest, designed to handle 1 million passengers annually, even though the entire Hambantota district has only 600,000 total population and almost no tourist attractions to draw international visitors. The airport operating at 5% capacity with literally one scheduled commercial flight daily, a small domestic connection to Colombo, becoming internationally infamous as the world's emptiest airport, featured in documentaries about government waste while costing millions of dollars annually just to operate and maintain the facility with essentially zero revenue generation to offset costs. Dinesh watches Sri Lanka's debt to China grow from zero in 2005 to over $5 billion by 2014, representing 10% of total foreign debt, with none of the Chinese projects generating revenues to service loans, the government using foreign reserves and borrowing from international markets at 6-7% to make payments to China, warning in memos this is unsustainable but being marginalized by pro-Rajapaksa officials who call him a Western stooge. Hambantota Port Phase 2 completes in 2013 with another $757 million in Chinese loans, bringing total to $1.4 billion, and the expanded port still sits 90% empty because the fundamental problem, wrong location, hasn't changed, losing $300 million over 2010-2016, unable to pay even interest on Chinese loans, let alone principal. China Exim technically able to demand repayment, but instead offering to help by converting debt to equity. Chaminda sees his catches drop 30% as port construction disrupted fish migration, while promised jobs never materialized because the port has almost no traffic, his community becoming poorer despite $1.4 billion spent on a useless port, many younger fishermen abandoning fishing to migrate to Colombo or Middle East. Priya's shop thrives in 2010-2015 as tourist arrivals surged to 1.5 million, then 2 million, expanding to a second location in Kandy, earning 120,000 rupees monthly, 100 la from both shops, buying a house and feeling middle-class success, not concerned about Hambantota or Chinese debt because tourism is booming. Kamara continues routine work at the tea plantation, exports steady at $1.5 billion annually, chemical fertilizers allowing yields of 1,800 kilons per hectare, the science of tea production well established over 150 years. The port handover and populist disaster, 2017-2021. In 2015, Rajapaksa loses the presidential election to Maithripala Sirisena, partly because voters tired of corruption and Chinese influence, and the new government faces immediate crisis. Sri Lanka owes China $8 billion with Hambantota Port, owing $1.4 billion it can never repay given annual losses. After 2 years negotiation, in 2017, Sri Lanka signs a controversial deal, leasing Hambantota Port to China Merchants Port Holdings for 99 years in exchange for $1.1 billion cash, essentially giving China control of strategic port on one of world's busiest shipping lanes, India-Middle East-Africa route, in exchange for debt relief. The deal criticized by India seeing this as China establishing military foothold, by opposition calling it selling the country to China, and by international observers citing it as classic debt trap diplomacy. Lend money for commercially unviable projects, wait for default, seize strategic assets. Dinesh, now mid-40s, sees the handover as confirmation of everything he warned about in 2007, the government admitting the port will never be viable, though the $1.1 billion provides temporary relief. Chaminda watches Chinese operators take over in 2017-2018, making the port even more off-limits to fishermen, the promised development never happening because the port still has minimal traffic, his income now 20,000 rupees monthly, 110, from reduced catches, the port standing as national, humiliation. Then in November 2019, everything unravels when Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Mahinda's brother, wins presidency on populist platform, immediately implementing massive tax cuts reducing government revenue 25% overnight. VAT cut from 15% to 8%, corporate tax from 28% to 24%, eliminating other taxes costing 700 billion rupees, $3.8 billion annually, that the government can't afford, given foreign debt service already consumes 70% of revenue. Dinesh watches the new Rajapaksa government eliminate revenue needed to service debts while increasing military spending and giving jobs to supporters, recognizing this is fiscal suicide. Then COVID-19 hits in March 2020, immediately collapsing Sri Lanka's tourism industry, which was generating $4.4 billion in annual foreign exchange earnings and directly employing 400,000 people in hotels, restaurants, transportation, and tour services, plus another 1 million people indirectly dependent on tourism economy, international tourist arrivals, dropping from 2.3 million visitors in 2019 to effectively zero during 2020-2021, as the country imposes strict lockdowns and global travel remains severely restricted, devastating the entire service economy that had become one of Sri Lanka's primary growth engines over the previous decade. Priya watches her shops go from 180,000 rupees monthly to nothing in April 2020. No tourists means no customers, laying off employees and closing one location, burning savings hoping tourists return but they don't, her income dropping to 30,000 rupees monthly, $150, from few local sales. Foreign exchange reserves fall from $7.6 billion November 2019 to $5.6 billion by November 2020 as tourism dollars disappear and remittances from overseas workers collapse. President Gotabaya, facing foreign exchange crisis, makes a catastrophically stupid decision in April 2021, banning all chemical fertilizer imports and mandating 100% organic farming nationwide within 6 months, claiming this saves $400 million annually in fertilizer costs and makes Sri Lanka the world's first organic nation, ignoring warnings from every agricultural scientist that yields will collapse because you can't transition to organic overnight without years of soil preparation. Kumara is horrified hearing the fertilizer ban, knowing immediately this will devastate tea because high-yield varieties require chemical fertilizers to produce 1,800 kg per hectare. Without them, yields will drop to 900 kg, a 50% collapse, and the $1.5 billion tea export industry will be destroyed. But petitions are ignored. Within months, predictions prove correct. Rice harvests collapse 40%, forcing Sri Lanka to import $450 million in rice, more than the $400 million supposedly saved. Tea yields drop 50%, causing production to fall from 300 million ki to 180 million kilala. Export revenues from tea collapse from $1.5 billion to $900 million, and overall agricultural output down 30%, creating food shortages. Kumara's plantation, which employed 20 pickers, lays off 8 workers because there's less tea with half the yield. His salary cut from 45,000 to 30,000 rupees, $150, as the plantation loses money, watching tea bushes that took decades to develop produce scraggly, low-quality leaves, the entire hill. Country industry collapsing because of one idiotic decree. Total collapse, 2021-2022. By late 2021, Sri Lanka faces a full-scale economic and humanitarian crisis unprecedented in the country's independent history. Foreign exchange reserves depleted down to critically low $1.6 billion, enough for less than 1 month of essential imports, including fuel, medicine, and food. The government unable to import adequate quantities of diesel for power generation, medical supplies for hospitals, or basic food commodities to feed the population. Inflation accelerating rapidly from manageable single digits to 12%, then 20%, then reaching 30% and climbing higher. As shortages drive prices up, the Sri Lankan rupee, which held remarkably steady at 180-185 per US dollar for years, suddenly entering free fall, plunging to 200, then 270, then 360 to the dollar, as the currency collapses, making all imported goods exponentially more expensive for ordinary people already struggling with income loss and unemployment. Dinesh watches reserves deplete $200 million weekly through late 2021 and early 2022 as government tries to pay for essential imports, knowing default is inevitable, but Rajapaksa refuses to approach IMF for bailout because IMF will demand austerity and reforms. Priya's shop barely survives 2021, but in 2022, Real crisis hits as fuel shortages become catastrophic. Gas stations run out for days, queues of 200-plus vehicles waiting 48 hours hoping for delivery, public transport disrupted, rolling blackouts 8 to 13 hours daily as Ceylon Electricity Board can't import diesel for power plants, Priya unable to keep shop open because there's no electricity 13 hours daily and she can't get petrol, her income dropping to zero, burning all savings borrowing from relatives to buy food at prices that doubled or tripled. In March 2022, Sri Lanka announces it's suspending foreign debt payments, the first sovereign default in the country's 74-year history since 1948 independence, unable to make $78 million payment on international bonds, admitting foreign reserves are below $50 million in 2 days of imports, the government completely bankrupt and cannot pay debts. Dinesh watches with grim satisfaction his warnings proved correct, but horror at suffering. Sri Lanka now cut off from credit markets, unable to borrow to import essentials. The rupee in free fall past 360, then 400 per dollar. Shaminda, who suffered 15 years from Hambantota Port, now faces collapsing national economy too. Fuel shortages mean he can't get diesel for his boat. When he does, the price increased 5x, making fishing unprofitable. His family struggling to afford food at hyperinflated prices, the port standing as monument to Chinese influence while Sri Lanka burns. Kumara lives through nightmare in April-May 2022. No fuel for vehicles transporting tea, blackouts disrupting processing. Plantation owners announce they can't operate at a loss and will shut down. Kumara suddenly unemployed at 65 after 40-plus years, surviving on 15,000 rupees monthly, 38 pension that buys 1 week of food. Revolution and Aftermath, 2022-2024. By April 2022, with fuel shortages reaching absolute crisis levels unprecedented in Sri Lankan history, queues of 48-plus hours with people sleeping in their cars overnight, waiting for fuel deliveries that might never come, multiple reports of elderly people dying in fuel queues from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and stress-related heart attacks, food prices inflating 80% or more, making basic necessities unaffordable for millions of families, power cuts extending to Sidandoarti, brutal 13 hours daily making normal economic activity and daily life virtually impossible, critical medicine shortages at government hospitals forcing cancellation of essential surgeries and leaving diabetics without insulin and heart patients without medications, and the Rajapaksa government arrogantly refusing to resign or even acknowledge responsibility for the crisis or approach the IMF for emergency assistance. Mass protests erupt starting in Colombo, initially just a few hundred primarily young people camping peacefully at Gala-Face Green Beach near the presidential secretariat, demanding "Go home Gota," referring to President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but then rapidly growing to thousands, then tens of thousands, then eventually hundreds of thousands as the grassroots movement spreads virally across social media, despite government attempts to suppress it, creating a historic multi-ethnic coalition bringing together Sinhalese, Tamils, and Muslims who are normally divided by Sri Lanka's ethnic politics, but now united in righteous anger at the Rajapaksa political dynasty that has dominated and corrupted Sri Lankan politics for much of the past 2 decades while systematically destroying the national economy through corruption, nepotism, and catastrophically incompetent economic policies. Priya, who lost her business, joins protests traveling to Colombo when she can get fuel, meeting thousands of other destroyed middle-class Sri Lankans, professionals who can't work because no fuel or power, small business owners who lost everything, retired people whose pensions buy nothing, all demanding government resign. Protests grow through May and June as conditions worsen, fuel queues miles long, power cuts extend to 15 hours, food and medicine unavailable, culminating July 9, 2022, when hundreds of thousands storm the presidential palace, overwhelming security, swimming in the president's pool, cooking in his kitchen, occupying the building as Gotabaya Rajapaksa flees to Maldives, then Singapore, the prime minister's residence burned, the entire government collapsing, arguably the most successful people's revolution in South Asia's modern history. The aftermath brings new government under Ranil Wickremesinghe, who immediately approaches IMF for bailout, reaching agreement for $3 billion program conditional on painful reforms, increasing VAT to 18%, cutting subsidies, restructuring $12.5 billion in bonds, forcing bondholders to accept 28% losses, negotiating with China to restructure $7+ billion owed, implementing governance reforms. Dinesh, now 51, nearing retirement, sees vindication as IMF economists confirm everything he warned. Chinese loans were trap, tax cuts were suicidal, organic farming was criminally stupid. Rajapaksa. Governments destroyed a country relatively prosperous in 2005, GDP 1,241 per capita, growing 4 to 6% annually, leaving Sri Lanka in 2024 with GDP only 3,475 per capita, barely higher than 2011 adjusted for inflation, poverty increasing from 10% to 25%, middle class destroyed, lost decade of development. Priya tries rebuilding in 2023-2024 as tourism slowly returns, 1.5 million arrivals in 2023, climbing toward 2 million projected 2024, but starting from zero, shops closed, savings gone, having to restart as small vendor earning 50,000 rupees monthly, $150. At 45, she's back to where she was at 25, 15 years of building erased by 3 years of collapse. Chaminda, now 62, survives on small catches in waters permanently damaged by Hambantota Port, the port still mostly empty even under Chinese management, a monument to debt-trap diplomacy that extracted strategic asset in exchange for unpayable loans, his community permanently impoverished by project that benefited only Chinese contractors and corrupt politicians. Kumara returns to plantation late 2023 when operations restart after government abandons organic mandate and allows fertilizer again, but at 66, earning only 35,000 rupees monthly, $100, supervising recovery of tea bushes damaged by 2 years without fertilization will take 3 to 5 years to restore. Full production, Sri Lankan tea industry suffering lasting damage, global reputation harmed, export markets lost to Kenya and India. Hambantota Port stands as most visible symbol of China's debt-trap diplomacy, lend money for commercially unviable project, wait for inevitable default, seize strategic asset. With Sri Lanka serving as case study, many developing countries study to avoid similar fate. The broader lesson is Sri Lanka's collapse resulted from multiple interconnected failures. Accepting Chinese debt for prestige projects making no economic sense, 2007-2017, implementing fiscally suicidal tax cuts, 2019, losing tourism revenue to COVID, 2020-2021, mandating organic farming, destroying agriculture, 2021, and refusing IMF until economy completely collapsed, 2022, each bad decision compounding previous mistakes until entire system failed. Sri Lanka's total foreign debt in 2024 stands at $37 billion, with China holding $7 to $8 billion, 20%, international bonds at $12.5 billion, restructured at 28% haircut. The country essentially bankrupt, requiring decades to recover. The human cost is staggering, 25% below poverty line compared to 10% in 2019. Middle class devastated, brain drain accelerating as 500,000 plus left in 2022-2023, life expectancy stagnating, political instability about whether reforms will be implemented or populists return. The four people, Dinesh, who warned about Chinese debt, Chaminda, whose livelihood was destroyed by useless port, Priya, whose business collapsed with economy, and Kumara, who lost his job to idiotic organic mandate, represent millions of ordinary Sri Lankans betrayed by their government, exploited by China, left to suffer consequences of decisions made by corrupt politicians who enrich themselves while destroying the country. Their stories a warning that economic development is fragile, debt can be trap, populist policies mask disasters, and recovery from collapse is far harder than preventing it.